We've been talking at church about how are the ways that we tell our church story. And sometimes we tell stories by reading books together and reading the stories that are in these books. And the two books that were in the Wonder Box are history books that were written about our church. The first one is a history from 1826 to 1926, and the second is from 1926 to 1976. And there are copies of these books for anyone in the church who'd like to borrow one. They tell about the early years of our congregation and what the buildings looked like and how they evolved over time, who the ministers were, and the major events that happened and who was involved. And we know that ours is a living history. And so we want to keep telling the stories about what happened and who has been in our congregation in the past and in the present. And one of the ways we keep track of that is with our membership book. And this is what it looks like on the outside. And on the inside of the membership book, all members are invited to sign their name or have their name written inside when they choose to become a member. And when someone turns 16 in our church, if you grew up in the church, you're invited to join as a member and sign at that point. Let's see what it looks like inside. On one side are the older entries, and they used to be typed into the book. And more recently, we've been inviting people to sign it. And our newest members have not signed it yet because we're not back in person, but as soon as we can gather, we'll have the book ready for our new members to be able to sign and add their names to this collective story of who the Unitarian Universalist Church of Nashua is. Thanks for sharing the slides. And storytelling and sharing memories is another way that we share the stories of our community. And it's one of the methods that I enjoy the most. I love telling stories. I've been in the church for about 4 years now, and you may notice that I love telling stories, and I love remembering stories that have happened and remembering them together. One of my favorites, I didn't enjoy it quite at the time while it was happening, while I noticed that there was a squirrel in my office. It became one of my favorite church stories because it was a story where I reached out for help from all the parents who were at the OWL training. And I said, I will run this training, but there's a squirrel in my office and I'm going to need some help scurrying it out afterwards. And we did. We had a whole team effort. It included water noodles and poster board, and the squirrel was found sleeping in the nativity creche at the top of a shelf. There's a lot in that story, and there was so much that I enjoyed telling it every time. And then the more I told it, the more we realized we should act this out. So that following Christmas, we acted it out in the sanctuary. And for those of you who were there, you may remember that Jed, our music director, played the role of the squirrel and brought the house down. It was one of my favorite worship moments. So the power of story helps bring back and bring us together. And that's something that we're going to be talking about this month and more today.
Our words for reflection this morning are, "What does it mean to be a community of story?" by Reverend Emily Gage. Reverend Gage writes, "My whole childhood was lived on one block of a neighborhood in Pittsburgh, but my horizons were much, much wider. From a very young age, I was transported by stories to worlds far and near. I ate too many cookies with Frog and Toad, made footprints in the snow with Peter in a snowy day, spied on the neighbors with Harriet, listened to Pa's fiddle in the evening along with Laura Ingalls, laughed and cried with the giant Gilly Hopkins, found out what happened next with Gene Fritz's Paul Revere, solved the mystery with Turtle in the Westing game, and so on and so on and so on. The list is endless. And all these people, these stories, both fictional and non-fictional, are part of who I am. Stories shape us in so many ways. When they resonate with our own experience, they tell us something about who we are. When they jolt us into a new perspective, they broaden our sense of the world. When they share where we have come from, they remind us that we are part of a larger narrative. The complexity of this is staggering. Salman Rushdie put it this way in his book, Midnight's Children. Who, what am I? My answer, I am everyone, everything whose being in the world was affected by mine. I am anything that happens after I've gone, which would not have happened if I had not come. Nor am I particularly exceptional in this matter. Each I, every one of the now 600 million plus of us, contains a similar multitude. I repeat for the last time, to understand me, you'll have to swallow the world. In some ways, it could be argued each one of us is a community or collection of stories. That is, in part, what this month's theme is all about. But we must also ask this question in a broader sense. What does it mean for Unity Temple Unitarian Universalist Congregation, or I say Unitarian Universalist Church of Nashua, to be a community of story? Part of what we do, of course, is listen to one another's stories. We do this in the joys and sorrows portion of our worship service, in informal conversation at coffee hour, or while our kids play. We witness shared celebrations of our stories, whether they be baby dedications or memorial services or other rites of passage. We create narratives of what could be in our shared faith in action gatherings and marches. Sometimes just sharing our story and having it be held by others is helpful. Sometimes hearing a story that sounds like yours, but with a different ending, can give you hope. Sometimes listening to someone whose perspective is totally different opens up new worlds and new understanding. In our religious community, we are shaped by the stories we encounter. In our religious community, we create a shared story of who we are and who we may become. May we open our minds and hearts to all the stories we encounter this month, both from our own lives and the lives around us.
My daughter, Olympia, has been super into stories for the last several months. She wants us to tell her stories. Sometimes it feels like literally all the time. Sometimes she wants magical, fantastical stories, but mostly the stories she wants to hear are stories about herself. Stories about her daily life, about the rain and how it was raining when I drove her to school that one day, about playing with her friends, about the time she got a little brother. There's certainly a piece of this that is about her stage of life. Toddlers are developmentally self-centered after all. But I also think it's a little more universal than that. We all like to hear and tell stories about ourselves. Think about that experience of being with or talking to family and friends you've known for a long time. How often do you end up sitting around reminiscing about those other times you've been together? We all love to tell stories about ourselves and about the communities that we're part of. These stories are ways that we tell one another about ourselves. We share our narrative, share who we are. And they're also the ways that we tell about our communities, that we share the narrative of our community and we share about who we are as a community. Storytelling is fun and it can be whimsical, but it is also a powerful identity-shaping tool. The stories we tell are one of the ways we build our identity as individuals and as communities. Just a few months before the pandemic, we as a congregation had a consultant, Mark Ewart, come to talk to us about some of the strengths and the weaknesses of our congregation. And one of the things he pointed out to us is that we actually weren't very good at telling our story. He noted that when he invited everyone to share stories at the beginning of the conversations that he had, very few people told actual stories. And he heard very little specifically about the people of our congregation, either the people of the church past or the people of the church present. When we talked about our history, he noted that our default is to talk about our buildings and our ministers, and not so much about the people who make up our congregation and what they did together. And so he encouraged us to work on storytelling, to practice together telling our stories, and more specifically, telling the stories of each other. Your board has taken up that challenge this year. We started the year with a virtual 3-part retreat and began that retreat by doing an exercise that our president, Brenna Woods, came up with. She gave us each 5 adjectives: encouraging, courageous, kind-hearted, determined, and funny. And then she invited us to take a few minutes to think of someone in the congregation who embodied each of those adjectives. Then she had us choose one of those people to tell a story about, specifically to tell a story about a time that we had seen them embody that adjective. We spent at least an hour, maybe more, telling stories about each other, of the people in this church who had influenced us. We'd start by telling one story, and then other people would want to tell a story as well. Some of the stories were about people who were in the Zoom room with us. Some of the stories were about people who had died and are no longer with us. Some were about people we had known for years, and others about people who we had just met. Some stories were fun, some were sad, some were joyful, and other were the kind that brought tears to your eyes, the good kind of tears. Although they were stories about individuals in our congregation, they were also about who we are as a community. Each of them was a piece of our story as the UU Church of Nashua. At the end of the retreat, we didn't want to stop telling stories, and so we didn't. Brenna challenged each of us to share the story we had told with the person we had told the story about, to send them a note, sharing with them the story and about how they've impacted us. And we committed to continuing the practice of storytelling at each of our board meetings this year. Instead of a chalice lighting each month, one person shares a story about someone in the church, and we each get a chance to respond with our own stories about that person. It has been a powerful, grounding way to start our meetings. For me, it always centers me in the people that we are serving, so that when we might otherwise get mired in making the budget balance or finding exactly the right words for a given policy, we're able to come back to those stories, to the people that we are doing this for, to this community that we serve. We've been able to come back to the story of our community because we are telling that story again and again and again. I didn't even really realize how much I appreciated this practice until Brenna and I were talking to the president and minister from another congregation about governance and what we feel like is working on our board. And one of my big realizations in that conversation is that we've been taking a full half hour at the beginning of each of our meetings for relationship building, for check-in, where we share a little bit about each of our stories and where we are at in that moment, and for this storytelling practice, the sharing of one story and the time to respond. So often in meetings, we want to hurry up and get on to business, especially Zoom meetings where you're kind of like, I don't want to spend another minute on the computer. But I think especially in this year of pandemic, in this year of meeting virtually, that our board has really been grounded by this intentional time of relationship building. And especially the way we have used storytelling to build our relationships with one another and with the congregation we serve. I really believe that your board is able to serve you better because of the time we take to be with one another and to be with the stories of our community. As a congregation, we are approaching our 200th anniversary. In 2026, which is not as far away as it sounds, it will be 200 years since the founding of the first Unitarian Congregational Society in Dunstable, as we were known back then. So it's a good time to be thinking about our story. I know I've been thinking a lot about the story that we want to tell about who we are today, and the story that we hope might be told 200 years from now. As we've been talking about changes to our building, I've been thinking about how that relates to our story. How do our spaces tell our story, and how do our spaces shape our story? And of course, in this time of global pandemic where it feels like we're creating history, I've been wondering about what stories will be told 50 years from now about what this congregation did when the world shut down. What is the story of us right now, and how will it be told in the future? This is an important time to get better at telling our story, the story of us now, and the story of how we got here. There's a Hamilton song that says that we have no control about who tells our story. But I'm not sure that that's entirely true. I do think that we get to shape our stories if we practice telling them. If we are able to tell the story of us, the stories of the people who make up this congregation and of what we do together, maybe we can start to shape the stories that will be told about us in 50, 100, even 200 years from now. Our church is about so much more than our buildings and our ministers. If we didn't know it before now, we certainly learned in this past year how true it is that our congregation, our church, is about the people, about all of you, not the space we inhabit. If we want our legacy to be more than just a litany of the changes to our building and the tenures of our ministers, we need to start telling our stories, the stories of our past and the stories about who we are today. And not just when our worship theme for the month is story, but all the time as a regular part of how we are together. So in that spirit, 2 of our board members, Burns and Andy and I, are going to take you through a storytelling exercise. You may want to pull out something to jot down notes, some paper, a pencil, or you can just keep some mental notes in your head.
Just like the board did back in August, we're going to give you 5 adjectives to get you started with, to get you thinking. And here they are: loyal, welcoming, kind-hearted, courageous, and passionate.
Now that you've got those 5 words, start thinking about who they make you think of in the church. Who have you seen as someone who is really loyal? What's a story about a time that they showed their loyalty?
Who have you seen as someone who embodies welcoming? And what's a story about a time they welcomed you or someone else?
Who have you seen as someone who is deeply kind-hearted? What's a story about a time that they showed that kindness?
Who have you seen as someone who lives with courage? What's a story about how they have shown that courage?
Who have you seen as someone who is passionate? And what is a story about their passion?
These are just a few of the words that you might use to describe people in our congregation. And it may be that those don't fit the people who have influenced you most. So take a moment now to just make a list of the people in this congregation who have influenced you. Who stands out?
Now, think for a moment about the adjectives that those people embody. How would you describe them? What stories would you tell?
So you can keep jotting things down, but we're going to take all this now and do some communal storytelling. We are going to make a word cloud together. We've done this before, so some of you might remember using Mentimeter. But we're going to make a word cloud of all those adjectives that you came up with, those words that you came up with to describe the people in this congregation who have influenced you. If you want to add to the word cloud, go to menti.com and put in the code that's shown on the screen. It's 59782217. 59782217. And then you can enter those adjectives one at a time, and we'll see them pop up on the screen. We've already got one up there. Welcoming, brave, kind. These words may describe just one person. But as we watch them come up, we can also see they'll get bigger if more than one person puts in a word. So you can see welcoming. Getting really big there. I love that. Talented, kind, supportive, strong. Let's watch these words come in together. Let's watch our story be built. You see loving coming up. Supportive, sensitive, funny. I invite you to keep on putting in those words. Let's keep telling our story. This is more than a collection of words, what we're looking at here. It is a piece of our story as a congregation. Each person who influenced us is also a part of us. And each of us is a part of who this community is.
We don't have time to tell every story encapsulated by these words today, but we want to encourage you to start telling these stories in at least a couple of ways. First, if you stick around for the fellowship time, share a story that you thought of today with the others in your group.
Second, pick at least one of those people who you wrote down as influential. And if they are still with us, send them a story about why and how they influenced you. Or if it is someone who has died, you can still write a letter to them, but keep it for yourself, or share that story with someone else who you think may benefit from hearing it. Maybe it will inspire them to send a story to someone else. and we can start a whole chainmail of loving stories about each other.
And you don't have to stop there. You can keep telling these stories anytime. As I said earlier, we love hearing stories about ourselves. If you are intrigued by learning more stories of our past and trying to shape the story we tell about our future, let me know. We're looking for some folks to work on putting together info about our history for that upcoming 200th anniversary. I'd love to have you be a part of telling our story.